Hi, everybody, and thanks for joining us today for CCL's Big Tent Climate Talks. This conversation is a quarterly series that spotlights leaders in the climate community. At CCL, we know that solving climate change requires a variety of policies and perspectives. This is why we do this work under a big tent. That includes folks from the right, the left, and every spot in between. In our Big Tent climate episodes, as you've probably seen if you've been to these before, we'll talk to a wide variety of climate leaders outside of CCL to learn more about how we can all better work together. For those of you who don't know, my name is Kyle Kammien, and I'm the Manager of Stakeholder Engagement and Government Affairs here at CCL. My work focuses on building the coalition of our partners and a coalition of partners in our Big Tent. Overall, our DC team keeps the pulse of on what other organizations are doing and finds ways that CCL can collaborate on our work with them. It is my hope that our session today will give you a taste of how our team's conversations with other organizations go. For today's episode, CCL is really pleased to be hosting a conversation with Levi Kamolnick, and he's a senior associate at Ceres, and Jason Yee, the associate director for outreach at the Center for Climate and Energy Solutions, also known as C2ES. In a moment, I will officially introduce them. But again, if you've attended these before, I want to make sure with a few gentle reminders, set our ground rules. We love our focus and we're open-minded here at CCL. So today's focus is going to be to listening and learning from the experience of our fellow climate advocates. If you bump into a moment or a reaction where you feel differently about something that's shared, really lean into that, see that this is an opportunity to learn about the larger climate movement and try to understand that perspective. In that vein, we know that building support for a meaningful climate policy, we have to require the biggest and broadest coalition possible. And that's the reason we want to host conversations like these. We want to bring people together to help talk about solutions. Learning from each other is how we're going to get this done. So I'm going to go ahead and introduce our guests. I'm going to start with Levi. Levi mobilizes Ceres' network of businesses and leaders, business leaders and partners to advance ambitious climate and clean energy policy at the federal level. As a member of the Ceres federal policy team, Levi leads our policy advocacy work around deforestation, transportation, and infrastructure issues, collaborating with congressional staff and business advocates to build towards Ceres' goal of a zero emissions future. Prior to joining Ceres, Levi was the state director of Environment Nevada, where he engaged decision makers at both the state and federal level on a variety of Western environmental issues, ranging from protecting lands, expanding renewable energy, wildlife preservation, and transportation electrification. His earlier work included organizing events with elected officials, co-authoring research reports, and working through 6 different states as a staffer for candidates seeking statewide and federal office. He holds a bachelor's degree in political science from the University of California, Los Angeles. So as you can see, Levi has an extensive background in the environmental space and the political space and can provide a lot of interesting insight for us today.
Thanks, Kyle.
Yeah, no problem, Levi. Is there anything I left out that you'd like to share?
I think you got it.
All right, terrific. Well, then I'm going to go ahead and introduce Jason, and then we'll hop into our discussion. Jason Yee is the Associate Director for Outreach at the Center for Climate and Energy Solutions, aka C2ES, where he researches, analyzes, and develops strategies and solutions for climate change and energy issues. Since joining C2ES, he has worked in the intersecting areas of policy, markets and business, and technology. His responsibilities include tracking and analyzing legislative proposals and regulatory action, creating and maintaining user-friendly federal web policy web content, and managing their corporate energy efficiency initiative. He also examines how federal agencies are using information and communications technology to perform their functions in a leaner, more efficient, and sustainable manner. Before joining C2ES, he led a practicum team for the World Wildlife Federation Fund's China for Shift campaign, aimed at identifying, assessing, and developing business and market-based sustainability initiatives for e-waste to help reduce China's carbon footprint and preserve biodiversity in key areas. He has a Master's of Arts, International Relations, and International Economics, concentrating in energy, resources, and the environment from the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies, and a Bachelor's of Arts in Political Science and History from the University of California. Obviously, Jason has a wealth of expertise. Jason, was there anything I left out that you'd like to let everybody know about?
Nope, I think you covered it. Thank you, Kyle.
All right, great. Of course. No, thank you both for joining us today. We're really appreciative having you both here. It's an important political moment when it comes to climate legislation and effectively reducing, emissions, and we want to have our volunteers be able to hear from you about that. So that's enough of me talking. Let's jump into our questions. Levi, I'm going to start with you. Can you tell our audience a bit about the why behind your organization and how you personally got involved in the climate movement?
Yeah, absolutely. So, Ceres really started because a leader in the investor space wanted to create a channel to put pressure from investors on companies. And what that kind of evolved into was working with companies to help them become more better sort of leaders in the space. And what that even evolved to after that was helping companies become advocates from that. So that's really what we do on the policy team. We take those companies that are already leaders and we help them and we give them the tools to advocate for the policies that you at CCL and other organizations are already helping to create. And by the way, sorry, how I got into the space is, I started in the campaign world, as you said. My idea was sort of to help candidates talk more about climate. Sort of a foolhardy notion that as a low-level staffer, I could do that. And I didn't really make that happen. I don't think. I think that, which isn't to say that a lot of the candidates I worked for weren't strong on climate, but I don't think I did much of anything to change that. But I learned a lot, and I transitioned that into the activist world and the environmental activism world, and that was a great opportunity. I worked for I was the chapter leader of a larger organization, but didn't work with the staff much at all. Local to me, which made the pandemic a pretty easy transition actually. And really just sort of learned what it takes to organize events with members of Congress, press conferences, all that kind of stuff. And the opportunity with Ceres has been going back to the more traditional model of working with a larger team, but taking a lot of that information and more on the institutional side now. But I think the work I what I learned from the activist world has been really helpful and informative in the work we do at Ceres.
That's great. Thanks for sharing that. It was interesting as you were describing Ceres. I think there's a kind of an interesting crossover in model to a degree with CCL in the sense that you're looking at businesses are coming to you that want to engage in the climate space and want to advocate in the climate space, and you're building the tools to help for them to use and training them on how to do it. And I think that's exactly what CCL does with our volunteers. They come to us already hungry, already interested in the climate, know that it's something that they need to work on and want to work on. And we just help them have the right tools and the right knowledge to be good advocates. So I think it's an interesting kind of crossover between our organizational models.
Yeah, absolutely. Everything is all about organizing, and again, just getting those tools to the people that need them. And some companies are very sophisticated, really don't need that much help when it comes to being advocates. Some people think that's a problem, but of course, our job is to lift up those companies that are leading in the climate space, and some need a lot more help, and that's great. That's where we come in. That's why I have a job.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Jason, I want you to have the opportunity to answer, the same question and kind of tell our volunteers about, what's the why behind C2ES and how you personally got invested into the climate movement.
Yeah, thanks for the opportunity. It's great to be here. So for those of you not familiar with C2ES, we've been around for 20 years, and our mission is to accelerate the transition to a thriving, just, and resilient net zero economy. We were originally founded as the POC around global climate change back in 1998, and since then, we have a new name, but our mission is kind of and work has kind of remained the same, where we work with policymakers, businesses, and other stakeholders to advance policies, actions, all to build support for effective and ambitious climate policies. One of the unique things about C2ES is that we were one of the first environmental groups to actually work with the business community. And that was one of the things that attracted me to join C2ES. I started as an intern, worked my way up to as an associate director. And for me, I view climate as an existential crisis where I wanted to do my part to help address. And so C2ES work with businesses, as well as being able to produce thoughtful research and analytical research, all of that kind of appealed to me. So it kind of just made sense for why I ended up here.
Interesting that how you landed there was partially out of your own desire just to see that you see climate as an existential threat, and you wanted to kind of put yourself to work in that space. I know that's how I ended up at CCL personally. Was I was working in the kind of political policy space, but was not feeling as fulfilled about it. So I really wanted that opportunity to do so. And because of my concern for climate and the environment, CCL was a good landing place for me. So I can definitely understand how how you ended up where you did. Well, Jason, for the second question, I want to go ahead and start with you. Can you talk a little bit more about the projects and areas of focus that you or C2ES generally are working on related in the climate space?
So that's both an easy and a very hard question to answer because we're a climate think tank. We have over 500 publications. A quarter of our publications are focused on market-based solutions for climate change. And we have a lot of activities going on right now. Just on the domestic front, for instance, our signature initiative is called Climate Innovation 2050, where we work with companies to identify pathways to decarbonization. We also produce a policy analysis, policy recommendations, and also convenings to kind of help move some of these policy ideas. We're also doing work with cities in terms of helping them build resilience. We have a report coming out in April, actually, taking a look at how climate resilience and activities as well to build economic development can all be interrelated and actually help improve not only development and resiliency at the local level. And so that report's going to come out in early April. We're also doing a lot of work around climate risk disclosure. So, I like to say that like the sun never sets on the C2ES empire because we cover all things climate. So.
And for our volunteers' knowledge, when you talk about developing policy recommendations, are you working at times like directly with elected officials, or what does that look like specifically?
I think it's both. One of the unique things about C2ES is that I always say that sometimes, when think tanks come up with ideas, it's like someone sitting in an office, typing something up on a computer. But for us, we go the extra step of actually talking to some of the companies that we work with to kind of get their thoughts of trying to marry the theory with the practice. And so that way, when we actually do make recommendations, we've kind of thought through how this could potentially work in the real world. And so there's some of that, and there's also talking to offices and helping them think through legislative opportunities and designing bills and whatnot.
Great. No, that clarification is really helpful. Thank you. And Levi, I want to give you the opportunity to answer that question too. What projects or areas of focus? I know there are a lot as well for Ceres, but maybe you could talk some more about the ones you specifically focus on, and then more broadly about the organization.
Sure, yeah, and Ceres is an interesting organization that, in the sense that we work on a lot of different issues in a lot of different sectors, oil and gas, transportation. I mean, you name the corporate sector, we have people at Ceres who are experts in it. But on the policy team, we kind of need to know a little about a lot of different things. And, primarily, we focus, more on the top line items and what we can do to sort of to create an environment where the business community can and does have an incentive to decarbonize their various scopes of emissions, et cetera. And we see the biggest opportunity there being in a reconciliation package. Which I'm sure we'll talk about later, but that's been our biggest focus. We've done lobby days, we've done support letters, we've done events. We're actually sponsoring an event with Punch Bowl News that just got announced. That's very exciting. That's going to be with the Siemens US CEO and then subsequently Senator Debbie Stabenow. So we've got a lot of different things going on, but yeah, fairly focused on what we can do with clean energy and climate. It's kind of our main area.
I know this is going to be a DC bubble comment, but they really built that Punch Bowl News empire quickly when they left Politico. But in case, thank you. That's super helpful. I think one of the challenging things when we talk about your organizations in comparison maybe to CCL's traditional model is CCL has been so focused on one solution primarily, or maybe like one category of solutions, we can call it if we want to look at pricing more generally, but certainly CF&D, carbon fee and dividend being our most preferred model. Whereas, I think that's a strength of ours. It's also can be limiting at times because because of all these other conversations that are happening in the climate space. And, your organizations try to touch on a lot of those at once, and just a different approach. But I think that lends me to this question that, what are thinking about, CCL and how you've interacted with CCL to date. And thank you again for being here today. What are some of your thoughts? And Jason, I'll start with you on how you think that, we can best be in this movement together.
Yeah, that's a really good question. And it's interesting that you use the word movement, because it's a reminder that no one person or no one organization for that matter will be able to solve the climate crisis. It's going to take all of us working together, and we're all going to have roles to play to reach that shared goal. I think one of the things that has always, that has always impressed me about CCL is your network, right? Like I think you guys have a chapter in every state except one. Is that right?
Yeah, we have
But
actually every congressional district we have a chapter in.
wow. So yeah, yeah. So I mean, you guys have reach, and so being able to mobilize your volunteers to talk to their local representatives to kind of make the local case for climate action, I always find that to be very powerful. I'm one of the few environmental folks still left over from the Waxman Markey days, and I still kind of have like the PTSD from that, even though I was just an intern. But one of the key takeaways from that experience was that educating staff is really important, and I feel like CCL is really good at that when they do their lobby days, and and outside of lobby days too. I think it's important to kind of focus on educating staff regardless if there's legitimate climate legislation moving or not. I think the opportunity to educate is vastly important on the House side as well. Because if you think about it, a lot of the House legislative aides, they're generally younger, they have a wider portfolio than their Senate counterparts. And so I think it's a good opportunity to kind of like come in and let them know what the actual state of play is in terms of the science of climate change, some of the policy options being considered, what other countries are doing. And I think all of this kind of builds the groundwork for the hopefully the future action of trying to get carbon pricing legislation.
I love that answer, and I have to say I totally agree on the House staff side. I had an old boss that used to say, they have to know the issues an inch deep but a mile wide, and they can just barely scratch the surface. They have to know enough to be able to get by, and that's all they have time to absorb. And that is, I think education is a huge focus of our organization, as you pointed out. And I actually had one of our volunteers ask me in a conversation last week about if we were doing enough to educate legislators and their staff. And I said, I think we're working really hard at it, and that we're not the only ones. I think both of your organizations are doing the same. And so hopefully, we're starting to see some results of that by, greater climate ambition in Congress. Levi, I want to give you the opportunity to answer the same question about how you think, Ceres and CCL and all of us can be in the movement together.
Yeah, well, I think one of the interesting things about climate change is that it really does affect everybody, but not equally. And I think the only way to solve it is if we democratize the tools to advocate and to make everybody to give everybody a voice in that. So I obviously believe that the business voice has a key role to play in that. But what CCL and other groups that engage the public do so well is to bring everybody into the conversation. And I, as much as I think the business community is important, it doesn't mean anything at all unless lawmakers believe that their voters care about this stuff and their voters are out there making their voices heard. So I think they, the more institutional side and the more activist side, like I was saying before, I think they complement each other really well, but you really can't have one without the other.
Totally agree. I think we're not going to have anything, successfully pass or move through Congress without demonstrated support from both, industry and business community and the grassroots, citizens community. On that note, and as we're talking about, trying to pass something successfully through Congress, and Levi, I'll start with you on this question. I wrote this question a couple of days ago, and given recent turn of events globally, it feels even more prescient. But right now is like a really uncertain moment for a whole host of reasons, and that uncertainty definitely applies to whether or not something is going to come through reconciliation or some other significant climate legislation will pass. Can you describe for our volunteers a little bit, how Ceres sees the moment and what you're doing at this moment to either support a reconciliation package or a climate package generally, and just kind of paint that picture for our volunteers?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we think that, and we have thought, since the beginning of this Congress, that this is the moment. This is it. Really, for the first time, we have 50 senators and a vice president who think that climate, needs a major piece of legislation on climate needs to pass. Obviously, there are disagreements, and that's one of the reasons why this hasn't happened yet, right?
Yes.
But that is unique, and of course, there may be opportunities down the road, but given the severity of this problem and how long we've waited to address it, this is it. We've got to take action on this. So we really think this is an important moment. As far as the outlook, I think there's, like you said, I think uncertainty is the right word. And I think the battle is just there's so many different issues right now that are facing the administration, that are facing Congress. This conflict in Europe is so unfortunate, and it's just going to lead to more, inflation in gas prices. I think we need to really rally behind the idea that a clean energy future is the key to stability in the energy market. And even before all this, there were these spikes and these things that were making life so hard for so many Americans. So we don't know what's going to happen. We believe, and we just had a series of meetings with congressional offices last week that lead us to believe that this conversation will begin again in a similar way as it did last year, hopefully with better results. And when it happens, like I said, we're going to be doing lobby meetings. You'll see at least one more big company support letter from us. Like I said, we have that event. We're going to be doing everything we can, and we're going to be encouraging all of our companies to be out front, calling for a major piece of legislation to address climate change.
That's great to hear, and I know the fact, even when we know that right now the conversation is stalled, I think it's so important that organizations like Ceres are continuing to have meetings. Bring their members up to the hill and kind of keep that drumbeat going. And then, as an aside to your point about, kind of securing our energy future, so to speak, I think in relation to the conflict that's ongoing right now in Europe, we've heard that a little bit in the last couple of weeks, right? We've heard that shift to clean and renewable energy would alleviate some of the economic strife that's happening over there as a result of this. So I certainly think that narrative is going to continue to be a part of the discussion. That's my personal belief, but it seems that it's ripe in this moment and that we're going to continue hearing that. Jason, I want to give you the opportunity to talk about that too, and kind of how C2ES sees the moment politically, and what you're doing now or looking to do in the near term.
Yeah, so I think Levi and I are thinking the same in terms of in regards to that question. C2ES views it as enacting ambitious climate and energy policy. It has broad support across Congress as well as the U.S. public, and this is probably the best chance we've had in over a decade to meaningfully address climate change, and we simply can't afford to waste that opportunity. I think for us, we kind of view what's currently happening with the Build Back Better agenda as being in somewhat of a cooling off period. As the Senate works on other legislative priorities, they were looking at electoral college reform. They're currently negotiating a government spending bill. They're going to have to be focusing soon on filling the Supreme Court vacancy, passing the climate, the Chinese competition bill, as well as, overlaid with that is the geopolitical developments happening in Europe right now. But we're going to be using this period to kind of maintain the drumbeat, as you're saying. We've been working with partners, businesses, and other stakeholders to kind of build support in Congress to kind of put pressure on Congress to pass climate and energy legislation based on last year's Build Back Better provision. And I think from our conversations with companies, they're totally engaged, and many of the companies are eager to kind of be vocal and out there and trying to look to add to the symphony, right, of voices calling for action here. And so that's why earlier this month we were able to pull together 27 leading companies to urge Congress to pass these provisions. And we've also undertaken a series of fireside chats with leading CEOs. We just had one last week, for instance, with Joe Dominguez, the CEO of Constellation Energy. We have another one lined up with Tom Lineberger, the CEO of Cummins, on March 16th, and we'll be announcing some additional CEO fireside chats as well. And this is another way that we're going to maintain the drumbeat in terms of what businesses are voicing in support of the climate provisions. And yeah, I think it's an interesting situation. I think we kind of had a playbook of what we needed to do in terms of developing an outreach strategy and implementing it. And then with the geopolitical developments and with the Supreme Court vacancy, it kind of raises questions in terms of what the timing could be. Yep. The budget resolution has to happen by the end of September. Right. And a lot of times people are very concerned about well, how come they're not talking about it right now? We kind of view it as based on the legislative calendar. They have a couple of months before they need to act. And so really, things could probably start picking up again, maybe April, May. And so that's when you're going to see a lot of groups and businesses really start to put the pressure on as well.
So I think that also another piece of the timing conversation that you just laid out is, not to be too on the nose here, but, typically Congress doesn't act until it has to act. And so, that September deadline puts them in a position that a few months before they're going to say, oh no, we have to do this now. So I think as far as the timeline goes, we share, we share that opinion to a large degree. And I think what we've all talked about here is that, CCL has been doing this as well with our volunteers through a number of different activations, whether it be to the White House or reaching out to their members of Congress or other things, is that it's even more important that we're all continuing to have these conversations on the Hill and with their legislators and staff with all of these distracting priorities, because it'll get lost amongst the list if we don't continue to bring it up and have it remain prescient. And so I'm glad to hear that your businesses and your members are engaging, and that we're all kind of aligned in that need to just keep the drumbeat going, and so hopefully the conversation can continue.
Absolutely.
Yeah, Levi, did you have something you wanted to add?
No, I think that all makes sense to me, and I just think we need to be clear that there's no future with fossil fuels that that doesn't include this kind of instability and insecurity, and we've got the answer.
That's right. We've got lots of policy options, that's for sure. So on this note about the efforts you all are taking and what CCL is doing as well, one of the things I think that people don't necessarily realize when they're not in it is that coalition building takes a lot of bandwidth, a lot of work, and not every group is really focused on that. So I'm just curious if you could share a little bit of your insight, each of you, on how important it is to work with other groups or organizations for your organization. And, do you have any other particular groups or organizations that you partner with that you think our volunteers might be interested to learn more about? Levi, I'll start with you.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I mean, our connections, in the more traditional environmental community are paramount. Groups like NRDC, CCL, WWF, Climate Nexus, just to name a few. They're key, and they play a different role than we do, but we work closely with them, and we share intelligence. We kind of like to align on different tactics, et cetera, and make sure that we're complementing each other and not just duplicating efforts. I should, of course, C2ES as well. I can't believe I didn't mention you right here, Jason. But yeah, those would be the ones I would name.
Great, thank you. And Jason?
Yeah, I mean, like it's a movement. There are a lot of different overlapping coalitions, and I think those coalitions have similar members, sometimes different members. But I think it's a great opportunity, because I think if you actually had one big meeting, that can sometimes take away the voice of smaller organizations, and sometimes you need to have more discrete conversations. And so having these overlapping groups and efforts, I think, are very important to make sure that everyone has a voice at the table.
Sure, I couldn't agree more with that comment. You bring together so many groups, and people are uncomfortable. They don't know people well enough. They're uncomfortable sharing information that they think is a little bit sensitive. They're just not a very outspoken person, whatever the case might be. I totally agree. It's really important to have those like one-on-one touches periodically. Otherwise, it doesn't matter how big your coalition is. Like it's not going to be as effective as it can be. Certainly have found that in my own work as well.
Yeah, and I just want to add that you guys have also been doing some great work with coalition building around Build Back Better. And so you guys need to be commended for that. You guys have brought together a great group of organizations, as well as being able to bring Hill staff to kind of share intel of what's happening. So kudos for you for doing that, by the way.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. No, that's been a big effort. And I have to say that our staff obviously did some great work there, but also a huge part of that is our volunteers have built such good relationships with so many members and their staff that we're a trusted partner to have those conversations, and we owe our volunteers a lot of credit for that, to be quite honest. So our volunteers and our staff that support them have done a terrific job.
Yeah, and the stories that you share about your volunteers engaging with senators, especially during the difficult negotiations last year, they were very cordial, they were very respectful, and it's night and day compared to some of the other efforts to kind of convince these senators to take action. So yeah, you guys have a really well-behaved volunteers. So kudos to that as well.
Thank you very much.
Not everybody does.
Yeah, thank you. I know they will love to hear that that's the shared opinion. That's great. So I'm going to move into some volunteer questions that I have here. Some of them are for both of you, some of them are for one. The first one I have that I think is maybe a little bit easier. I'm not sure. Jason, they'd like to know how C2ES was founded.
Yeah, that's a great question. So we were originally founded as the Pew Center on Global Climate Change back in 1998. At the time, the Pew Charitable Trust was a grant-giving organization, and around I think 2006, 2007, they started to change to become more of an established nonprofit organization. So they stopped being a foundation in the typical sense, and so we had a decision to make. So we had some internal reflection of what we wanted to do, and we talked to various policymakers, various businesses to kind of get the sense like should this organization continue on in some form, and the overwhelming consensus was yes. And so we officially launched as C2ES in November 2011.
Great, thank you for that. That's helpful. Question for both of you. So I'll start with Levi. This one's a little bit more in the weeds. So are C2ES or Ceres trying to quantify the effects of Canada's ambitious carbon tax?
Simple answer is not an issue we are looking at right now, to my knowledge.
Okay.
Same. We did some initial work when Canada proposed their approach to pricing carbon, but we haven't quantified anything yet.
Okay, great. All right, here's another one, and I'm not familiar with this Washington Post report, so I'm behind. So somebody asked if there's any comments or advocacy on yesterday's Washington Post report, and the quote they're referring to is, "Some of the nation's best-known corporations are undermining their promises to slash emissions by donating significant sums to Republicans attorneys general who have emerged as frequent courtroom foes of climate policies and regulations, according to a report shared with the Climate 202. So essentially asking, what are your efforts as organizations to kind of handle those kinds of conversations with corporations that are making those, maybe counterproductive, if you will, political donations? And either one of you can jump in when you're ready.
Sure, I can get that started. Well, like I said, when Ceres was started, it was, we were more about pressure on corporations, and this working sort of in concert is a bit newer, and that's become an important part. But of course, we a big part of our work is leveraging investors to put pressure on companies, for the good. And definitely this has been last year was a pretty tough year in terms of a lot of companies coming out and engaging in a pretty unproductive dialogue, particularly some of those trade associations that represent a lot of the company, or quote unquote represent a lot of the companies we work with. But we were doing everything we could to mobilize companies to make it clear that they don't support a lot of the things that groups like the BRT and the Chamber of Commerce were putting out there. And again, for those companies that are just not on the right side, we want to counter that with the good companies as well that are doing what they can to put out a different message.
Yeah, it's certainly a difficult needle to thread. There's no question on that. And Jason, do you have any thoughts there?
Not really. I think the one thing I probably should note that is that we have a business council, and a lot of times people assume that we're a trade association because we have a business council, but we don't. We have 40 companies that we work with, and we don't speak on behalf of the companies. And so yeah, just would clarify that. Yeah,
of course. No, of course, you're not speaking on behalf of them. Just curious what those conversations were like, if you could share. But absolutely. As I said, it's a difficult conversation. I mean, where I think when it comes to the political spending world, the challenge is that especially if you're a business, coming from working for a political action committee myself for a company for several years, no candidate is going to be completely aligned with you on every issue. And so the question becomes, where as a corporation do you start to draw those lines of what priorities are going to be the most important? And I think we're seeing, my perception, obviously you all have, members that you talk to on a daily basis, but my perception is what we're seeing is that that's becoming more important. Climate is becoming more important on that list of priorities for businesses. And it's shifting their political spending behavior and other behaviors. But we're just not every company's there. Is kind of my perception of what's happened here with reference to this report.
Sure.
All right. So another one I have for you both is a volunteer of ours attended a GOP forum of congressional candidates on Tuesday. And in their discussion, the candidate or the volunteer offered the candidates help on climate messaging. And they welcomed the candidates welcomed an email and talking points or text for their website around climate. So they're asking where maybe could they find some talking points to draw on or some information to draw on that you think could be helpful for potential GOP candidates that want to have good messaging on climate. And Jason, do you want to start if you have any thoughts?
I think that's a tough question. I mean, it kind of really depends on what the candidate's interested in, because I think climate is it's a very big topic, and there's a different ways that Republicans are starting to think about climate. We've seen a lot of focus on innovation. We've seen focus on natural climate solutions. We're seeing even conversations around carbon clubs as well. And so I think there's a bevy of opportunities to I think pursue these topics. And I think a lot of organizations, like I think CCL has some great talking points on some climate policies. Ceres probably does, as well as C2ES. And so I think there are a number of NGOs that could have some resources that could be of interest.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. I think that generally the more business oriented messaging, I think is more the way to go. It's what makes it a hard question is that we really haven't, nothing's proven to be, there's no proven model on this yet, right?
Yeah,
so.
absolutely.
To some extent, I think it's anybody's guess what exactly the talking points that are going to be effective are going to be. I think generally at groups like C2ES and Ceres, and of course you guys are doing that conference later this year as well, the Conservative Climate Conference. So I think that there's definitely some emerging progress, but I really just think the jury is to some extent still out on this one. And, I think it's, the talking points are going to be key, but it's also just the environment and the extent to which, voters and groups like CCL are going to be able to put pressure on the politicians to make that action. That's really going to be key here.
Yeah, and a couple of thoughts I have generally based on what you both just said. I think I would suggest to this volunteer, and they may already be ahead of me on this and be thinking about this, but, consider the industries that are important to the area that you live in, and then kind of go out and look at C2ES's website or Ceres website for specific commentary on those industries or some businesses that are leading in that industry and what they're doing effectively on climate. I think another thing I would suggest is, when we're thinking about Republicans generally and some progress we're seeing around the climate discussion, maybe visit the House Conservative Climate Caucus's website and see what they're talking about and how they're framing this. Because I think, that caucus is up to more than 70 members now, which is, tremendous. I personally see that as a sign of progress, that there is a conservative climate caucus that has that large of a membership. We'll see how successful they are. The jury remains out on that, but at least we have something. So I think, based on what you said and some of those other things, those are some recommendations I have for that individual. Okay, great. Thank you both. I have one more question here for Levi, and this is a pretty broad question, so you might want to dial it in a little bit to a specific example. I know Ceres has a lot of efforts for helping businesses kind of improve their sustainability practices. You host a lot of webinars, seminars, all kinds of stuff like that. So what could you say that Ceres has accomplished in improving sustainability for the business community? Like, what are a few things you think you could point to specifically?
I mean, a lot of the changes that you make are hard to track, but and we, in a lot of ways, try to stay behind the scenes on a lot of that stuff. When companies come to us and they want to become more sustainable, they're usually not trying to publish that Ceres is the brains behind whatever that is, and it may not necessarily be the case. But we work with companies who come to us and want to improve and want to improve their scopes 1, 2, and 3 emissions. So, I think the biggest thing we do is just sort of generally moving the needle and generally shepherding companies into a more sustainable practice. So it's really tough to say one thing. And I don't know that it would be fair to any one company to say, oh, well, here's something, we did to make X company more sustainable. But I think, we try to be a resource when we can. And
so by and large, you're doing a lot of education.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the recent, shareholder vote with Exxon was something, we were pretty involved in. So there's a lot of things like that we help, sort of contribute to. But I think it's really tough to say here's the causality of something we did.
Great. No, I think that context is great and is helpful. Well, we're close to time here, so I'm gonna give you an easier question here to wrap it up. That's a little more, personal. So I'll start with you, Levi. Like, what's on the top of your stack today? Like, what are you reading that you think our volunteers might be interested in? Or it doesn't have to be climate related; it could be anything.
Yeah, well, what I happen to be reading right now is not at all really climate related. And it's actually President Ulysses S. Grant's memoirs, not to be confused with some of the biographies that are out there. And what I really enjoy about President Grant, who's known as sort of being one of the more corrupt presidents we had, which I think is partly sort of a vestige of the Lost Cause movement, is, he was not a particularly well-educated president, although he did go to West Point. Some people think that's great education, which I'm sure it is. But, nor was he, particularly an intellectual or somebody who was, elected to be president because he had such nuanced ideas. But, this was a very fraught time for the country. For a lot of people, that must have felt like the world was kind of coming to an end. And I'm really inspired by people who really looked, throughout history, who have looked doom in the face, on the road to better things. And I think particularly in times like this, that really can feel pretty, much like the world could be coming to an end. It's important to remember that, we're not the first people in history to feel like that, and that there is hope, that, there's something good on the other side of all this.
That's a great message. And what little I know I grew up in St. Louis, Missouri, and there's a place that actually the Anheuser-Busch family owns called Grant's Farm, that Grant had a farm at, but he eventually lost because of poverty. And one thing I know about him is that he spent a lot of his life in poverty before his success, and ultimately towards the end of his life again. And then his memoirs helped save his family financially, if I recall correctly.
Well, yeah, I think the one thing that people who know his history know is that he was not a very successful investor, but I would argue he was actually a pretty good president.
All right, great. Thank you very much. And Jason, do you have one?
Probably something not that deep, but recently I've read Station 11 by I think Emily St. John Mandel. It's a book about survivors of a global swine flu pandemic and the rebuilding of society afterwards. I heard about the book when the pandemic first happened, skipped on it because I thought it was too on the nose, but there's now an HBO series, and a really good friend recommended it last month, and so I was like, fine, I'll give it a try. Honestly, it was one of the best books I've read in a very long time. I couldn't put it down, read it in one go. And like some of the themes in there like kind of stuck with me. The whole I guess the juxtaposition between technology and art. In the book, technology seems to crumble with the fall of society, whereas art's able to endure. And to me, that kind of really stuck with me, given the real life pandemic that we're in, where it seems like technology seems to have entangled everything in our life, right? In terms of communications, in terms of entertainment. And then, for me, I kind of feel like art has kind of suffered, during the last 3 years.
Yeah.
And so it's kind of giving me some food to thought. And it's not just about a pandemic, but it's, the rebuilding of society and hope and all these other, good things to kind of be hopeful about as we look hopefully towards the end of this one.
Absolutely. Well, thank you both for sharing that. We're right up against it on the 45-minute mark, so that was perfectly long answer, Jason. Thank you very much. This was a great conversation today. There are a couple of brief reminders in the chat about where you can find links, and there are also links to our Citizens Climate Lobby and C2ES and Ceres websites if you'd like to learn more or check some other things out. We'll be back next quarter, and thanks again to both of our special guests, Jason and Levi, and all the important work that C2ES and Ceres are doing. Thank you both for being here today.
Thanks, Kyle, and thanks for everything you at CCL are doing.
Thanks for having us.
Of course.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Citizens Climate Lobby's training program. You can tune into more episodes anywhere podcasts are available. Inspired by what you heard today? Join Citizens Climate Lobby to advocate for bipartisan climate solutions. Go to community.citizensclimate.org to find more trainings, resources, your local chapter, national action teams, discussion forums, and more. Be sure to like our Facebook page and follow us on Twitter and Instagram @CitizensClimate. We also invite all of our listeners to subscribe to our YouTube channel for more inspiration.
Like what you hear? Recommend us to your friends and make sure to give us a 5-star rating.
It helps us show up on other listeners' feeds. Feel free to pass on any suggestions for future episodes in the comments as well. And together, we are creating the political will for a livable world.